Tim, welcome to Courage to Advance podcast. I'm so excited you're here with us today.
Thanks, Kim, for having me.
So let's start off by telling the audience a little bit about what has brought you into being a recruiter.
It was probably 11 years ago that I started the business, and what was the catalyst was um, I had a different recruiting company that had approached me and wanted me to help them start a vertical. And it was at that point where I sat back and thought, if they think I have the skill set to do this, maybe I should just go for it. And so after spending some time in some big sales organizations and also being in a startup, I thought, if I don't do it now, when am I going to do it? So 11 years ago, my wife and I took the jump and never looked back.
And the company, as we said earlier, is Orin Rice,
Yep.
which I know has a personal story for you.
It's actually the road I grew up on.
I love that. It gives a little bit more of a personal reason.
Yeah.
We know the job market is really interesting right now. There's a lot of uncertainty. And I think that's one of the reasons I was so excited to talk with you, to really get from your perspective, what should people be thinking about, especially if they're thinking about making a transition or if they've been impacted. I'd really love for us to start, kind of talking about the current job market from the lens that you see it. And then, just kind of giving people a sense of what that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, there's really three different kind of markets. There's the employer market where the employers have the power. There's the employee market, which we just went through at the beginning and the tail end of COVID. And then you have the uncertain market, which we're in right now. And so the worst market to be in is the uncertain because it cripples a lot of people. Businesses as well as people don't know if they should be making a hire, or employees don't know if they should be making a move, because if they make a move, could they be the last person on the boat and the first person off the boat? So uncertainty really kind of drives a lot of market paralyzation from both the employer and the employee side. So hopefully we can get past this here relatively soon, but we're definitely in a market where it's very uncertain. And what you're seeing is it's not just the tariffs that are bringing the uncertainty, it's the American Brand Association. So even companies that sell technology and their customers might predominantly be here in the US, they're worried about who buys their customers' product. And if they're international, if you're McDonald's as an example, well, people stop going to McDonald's. Here locally, there's going to be a tariff of the beef coming in from Australia or New Zealand or wherever the beef is coming from. And so we're all kind of anticipating that uptick because people in Britain are mad and they don't want to go to an American restaurant in Japan. So the uncertainty really does spread pretty quick.
And so you mentioned three, and I think just even though we're in this period of uncertainty, can you just speak just briefly to the dynamics of the first two?
Well, it's funny too, because everybody will talk about ghosting, right? There's always two sides to the ghosting story. And you can really tell who's going to get ghosted based on what kind of market you're in. So if it's the employee market, that's where the candidates have the power, where they can have multiple offers, things are accelerating. They don't really have to make decisions as promptly because there's a lot of opportunities coming at them. Well, when it shifts, like it did in September of 2022 to the employer market, I think the catalyst of that really was when Elon Musk, from a technology perspective, went into Twitter and cut half of their engineering team. And what that did was allowed all the other companies that were thinking about letting go of individuals see that, hey, Twitter didn't break. He just cut half of the employees. And so we can do the same thing. When that happened, there was a surplus of people in the technology space. It became an employer-driven market. So the wages weren't accelerating and the things that follow also kind of decreased.
In this uncertain market, because we've got the changes the current administration's making, the tariff threats that are happening, the larger international brand impact. I know even on our end in the work we do from the career coaching and career transition side, we are seeing companies really hesitating to know if they should be investing in growth or if they're needing to make cuts into headcount. And I think last year, what we noticed was cuts being made more strategically when they were being made around investment more for AI.
Yep.
And it feels like now there's this, there's the unknown as to if we have to make cuts, it's not even necessarily to make them to invest in that place right now because of the uncertainty that's happening. And we're also seeing that, that growth consideration really, being just kind of people try to decide, do we have the space to invest in the growth or not? So we're seeing a little bit of that for sure in our business as well. When you think about the candidates you work with, predominantly sales professional role with organizations that are, that can be global in size, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you see candidates make when they're trying to really pivot into different roles or industries during these uncertain times? Because we know that people have to provide. There's all
Yep.
these other forces. So let's talk a little bit about that, because I think that's something that is really relevant to what people might be experiencing today.
When you're making a pivot, the first thing that you have to look at is what market are we in? Because when it's the employee market, you can make any pivot you want because there's a shortage of people to fill those roles. The one thing that individuals, when it shifts over to the employee market, what they don't take into consideration is where they are at their career. And usually what that means is how much are they making?
Mm.
And so as an example, if you're trying to make a pivot and we'll just use easy, simple math, but if you make $100,000 and you want to make a pivot, the wrong messaging that you can say to somebody is, I know I'm going to have to take a haircut in what I'm making, so I'm prepared to do that. Versus, hey, I've done my research, and based on my research, I know that I'm going to be making 60,000, so I'm looking for something around that amount. Because then it tells the person that you're talking to that you've done the research and you know what you're getting into, versus them having to inform you. The biggest mistake is, one, not knowing what cycle we're in, because if it's an uncertain market, it's a very difficult time to pivot because everyone's trying to pivot. And if it's not a employee driven one, know your value relative to the market.
So really doing that legwork and that research is really important.
I mean, even in a healthy market where you're getting multiple offers and it's an employee driven one, the example that I always use is if I were getting married, and I needed somebody to bake a cake for me, I'm not going to ask you to bake me a cake because you make brownies twice a month. I'm going to go to somebody who does it for a living, because I think it's human nature to think that we can do everything and do anything. But what people are paying for at a certain point in your career is specialization. So you've got to really focus in on what you do well and know what your value is compared to that pivot that you're making. And usually
Yes.
it means you're going back.
So let's talk a little bit about that more, because I think that is something where we see people, and you and I have had discussions prior around job seekers, and really this idea of like, you either think about it from a functional lens or you think about it from an industry lens. But there's knowing that, and when you and I talked about it, that was one of those kind of crystallizing moments of like, that makes so much sense, especially when we're in an uncertain time. So let's talk a little bit more about what does it mean to be in that functional, versus industry, and a little bit more about how that pivot might look.
Let's say, as an example, I want to make a pivot. Right now, I'm in recruiting and I'm not in technology. So if I wanted to make a pivot to a similar role, it's pretty easy. I go to another recruiting company and I can talk about my experience and the results that I've had, and they can address what is my market value, and we can see if it's a fit or not. If I'm trying to get into something different, let's say a technology company, what I need to look at is what are my transferable skills, or what is my transferable industry. And so if I was going to make that pivot into a technology company, I would want to focus on ones that are trying to address things that recruiters have as pain points. So whether it be an applicant tracking system or any kind of AI addressing what recruiters might do, because I've got one half of the equation. There's either the role experience, or there's the industry experience that they can draw from. But if I have neither of them, it's almost impossible to make a pivot on that.
So we see a lot of people that have a desire to be in tech, right? Or who come from tech and who feel like the only other, because they've been in tech for so long, the only thing they can do to make the kind of money they've made is stay in tech. Let's talk a little bit about that, because I think that's a fallacy that people may not realize. There's alternatives than just
Mhm.
those two.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on where you are in your career,
Hmm.
because certainly what happens is you're getting compounding on what you've done, and you're climbing a ladder from a compensation perspective. And so there can be some truth to, it's going to be hard to make a pivot. Um, but the question is, can you take a step backwards to go two steps forward?
Hmm.
Because a lot of times it's not always monetarily where people are trying to make the pivot. It's also about longevity. And so in tech roles, a lot of times these roles will go 2 to 3 years. Where if you get into manufacturing, distribution, other industries, people are there for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years with one company. There's a lot of staying power. I think a lot of times when people are looking at these pivots, they're looking more from a, what does the balance of money to stability look
Hmm.
like?
Would you also say that sometimes there is a big upside potential to something that's maybe not on the surface as attractive of
Yes,
an industry?
yes, 100%. It's one of those that it's not always the glam that brings the money. It's the things that people need and use all the time, right? Like if we're gonna have a down market and my water backs up in my house, I don't have the skill set to address it. I need to hire a plumber. And so there's certain industries that are just very recession proof,
Hmm.
and ones that not a lot of people are getting into. And in that example, you don't have to become a plumber. There's a lot of people that are getting ready to retire. And what you're seeing is from a generation to generation, there's not a lot of passing down of these businesses. There's a lot more of these businesses that are for sale because people want to forge their own path. They don't want to take over the family business. So there's a great opportunity for people, whether it be franchises or, buy, sell business, whatever these might be, to create a different path, and not be locked into what you've done in the past from a corporate perspective.
I think that's a really important piece to share. I know in a lot of the career coaching our team does, there are people who part of the experience is to understand, is the path that they just left the right path for them in
Yeah.
today with everything they have in their life. And for some, it is going down that entrepreneurial road that could look very much like you described. And I think it's a really important factor to bring in when people are thinking about making a change, or a change is forced upon them.
Yeah. I think it's important to talk through why you're making the pivot, because the grass
Yes.
isn't always greener, and really identifying like what are the things that are missing and the reason that you're exploring a move. So I think having somebody that you can talk to, whether it's career coaching or a trusted, friend advisor who talks through it and says, hey, maybe what you need to do is fix what's right here, because if you go to XYZ company, it's going to be the same problem, just different logo. And sometimes it is, you need to change, right? Like
Mhm.
if you're undervalued in the market, or there's been a change in leadership and you don't see eye to eye with the principles that they're bringing in. But having that kind of sounding board is very important.
That's very, very important, which takes us into talking a little bit more about us having a strong network. And
Yeah.
I think this is something that we all inherently know, and in some degree, many of us do. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for most to really build that network more effectively, especially as we get more back into more face-to-face time. And so I really would like to hear you share a little bit of your thoughts on that, but also how can people leverage working with somebody like yourself when maybe your network doesn't have as broad of reach as
Mm.
you initially think it might?
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost, a recruiter can accelerate that. So if you've neglected your network, what they're going to be able to do is identify, like we're having this conversation, very specifically, like here are the places you could pivot based on your experience. And rather than you doing a lot of the research, they might be able to expedite that by saying, hey, you're making 120,000 right now. Are you going to be able to live on 70? And
Mhm.
it's going to be a realization point of, no, I can't. So they can accelerate the fact that you haven't developed a strong network.
Mhm.
And they can also open doors that sometimes might not appear to be open, based on the conversations and the things that might be peeled back during that conversation. From a networking perspective, I think it's human nature to network when you need something.
Mhm.
And the example that you will hear is, you can't just go to the garden when you need a carrot. You got to go plant the seeds. Or if you go shopping when you're hungry, you're going to buy everything in the store, whatever analogy it might be.
Yeah.
The reality is, you've got to continuously go out there and do things differently. Otherwise, you're either one, neglecting your current network, or two, you're not growing it. So you're getting
Mhm.
groupthink. And so I think what people need to do is evaluate, how much time am I spending on building my network, whether it's for current business or things in the future? And then two, am I doing things different, or am I basically staying in my same safe ecosystem?
And what do you recommend for that balance between digital and in person? And I think, there's so much of the LinkedIn world, right, that we
Yeah.
all have. So I really curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think Jamie Dimon, if you haven't heard his rant on remote working, you should check it out. It's a good 90-second to 120 seconds. But I mean, part of what he's saying is, it's not just about people, the fear of employers having that people aren't working as hard or as much. There's also that human element of people who are working remotely are being passed up for promotions that they would probably get because they're not getting the face time.
Mhm.
And I think that relates to, if you're networking just from a digital perspective, you're missing that human connection that we've had throughout history, that has
Mhm.
been changed very recently to a very digital experience. So while I can see your face and I can sense your emotion, there's also body language things that I might not be able to pick up on that you pick up on person, or something in the environment happens that you both experience together, versus I'm in my environment, you're in your environment. So we're not truly experiencing it the same way. I think it's good to do both, because digital can expand you to places you might not be able to go. I
Mhm.
was on a call learning about retirement planning, and there was somebody from Argentina and somebody from New York and somebody from London. And we were all having a conversation where I'm not going to fly to those places to talk to these people who are trying to figure out the same things.
Right.
And so I think it's similar when you're networking, of how you can accomplish different tasks with the in-person versus the digital.
I think that's a very important point, and especially when we're just starting to see more and more of these in-person opportunities. And I think too, it doesn't have to be a formal event
Yeah,
that people go to, right? It could also just be, reaching out to somebody, having coffee, finding common ground, even in community where we
yeah.
just naturally come across each other, and having an opportunity just to stop and talk and take a little bit of extra time, maybe.
There's meetups for, if you're gonna go on a run, if you're gonna play pickleball, join a book club, right? What's making a resurgence is Barnes and Nobles. Like, Barnes and Nobles is dead, it's
Yes.
coming back. And I don't know if you've gone into those anytime recently. The experience is great, and they've created the community that I think that Starbucks is trying to gain back, that third place.
Mhm.
And so there might be opportunities for the things that you love and enjoy, where you can expand your circle.
So if we were to say, hey, let's think about like what are the top 3 tips you would give people about how to rethink, networking right now, if they especially if they're impacted
Yeah.
in job search, what would that be?
Well, I think first and foremost, do something different. I wake up, I have my coffee, like, we do things that feel comfortable, and get outside of your comfort zone. That's going to be a huge one. Number two would be mixing it up from a digital and an in-person. And so
Mhm.
you're seeing, which one are you more successful at? Are you more successful at the digital version, or going in person and having conversations with people? And then the last thing I would say is, think about somebody else, right?
Mhm.
I think that a lot of times we get so consumed about what's going on in our world, where sometimes the best thing you can do is help somebody else because it opens doors that you're not trying to open. I'm not saying
Yes.
go out and do something because you're going to get something back, but just inevitably it comes full circle. I mean, I believe that when you go out and try different, I'll give you an example. I'm on this I'm on this board for Shoreline Community College, and it's a business advisory board where they meet once a quarter and you got to approve what's going on in the school because they get government funding. And I just did it because I wanted to give back and be part of the community. 5 years into it, one of the board members who had just stepped down called me up and says, "Hey, we have this search for this position." I never in a million years would have ran into that person, bumped into them, and they probably wouldn't have reached out to me based on what they were looking for, but it was a perfect fit.
It's
I'll
so
put the
much
bar.
of where we're at. It's a great example. Like, just sometimes we forget to look where we're already spending our time
Yeah.
and realizing that there's nothing wrong with sharing what we're searching for, expressing that we've been impacted by the uncertainty, or we're really starting to think, and really crafting and putting that out there can really
Mhm.
bring a lot of good results if we just think about it,
Yep.
looking closer by. So let's talk a little about, you see a lot of resumes. There's so much debate around um, resumes today and what works and what doesn't work, and AI and all these different
Yep.
things. But I think from the lens of a recruiter, I would say, what are the most common mistakes you see in a market like this that is uncertain?
Mhm. I think first you got to take a step back and think who's going to be looking at the resume.
Mhm.
People like me, internal recruiters, sourcers, they're going to be the first line of defense. And I say that from a perspective of, I think sometimes people try to make their document look a certain way. And if you're sitting in the shoes of a recruiter, some of these individuals are looking at hundreds of resumes a day. And so when you're trying to make multiple columns or fancy graphics, my thing is always you want your resume to look like everyone else's resume, but you want your content to be better. And so the biggest mistake that I think people will make is try to make it fancy versus having the impact of the information on the resume. So
So
keep
the
it simple,
substance, yeah.
substance, 100%. So, you know, how many people read a magazine or a newspaper? The numbers are going lower and lower. So if you have multiple columns on your resume, as I'm going through hundreds of resume, I'm already thrown off because I'm not processing a lot of information that way versus all the way across the screen. So first thing is like looking at what other people are doing, and 99% of people have it formatted that way. And then from a what to have on there, you have to have measurables, measurables, measurables. It doesn't matter what you do, but how many people have looked at a job description and thought, like, this was nothing? Like, what did I just read? It's a whole bunch of
Yeah.
words. And well, on the flip side, if I can't look at your resume and know that you're good at what you do, what's going to make me talk to you? Either your tenure, and then there's other little things like, have you had somebody else look at it and proof it? Because if you're doing little things like you're spelling a word wrong, if you send it to me as a Word doc, well, you've approved it on your computer, but my Word hasn't approved it. And so I can see if you spelled something wrong.
Hmm.
So you should always PDF it. And if you're gonna do little things like abbreviations of a month, well, if you abbreviate 1 month and the next one you don't, I'll have clients that will reject a resume for something as small as that. So sweat the small details, make it look uniform, but then just have really good content.
So I think those are really, really great tips. Talk a little bit about, where does the fear around AI and the bots reading the resumes, from what you've been able to experience and research, what's the reality around that?
Well, I mean, there's certainly how can we make things more streamlined, but when I was at a networking event 6 or 7 years ago, and you could say, hey, 6 or 7 years ago was a lifetime, but there was a very prominent tech company who had a AI division, and they were asked, hey, how much of this are you using to screen through your resumes? And they were doing none of it,
Yeah.
none of it. And I think, is there some of it? Sure. But at the end of the day, if a company needs to hire, they are going to look at all the resumes, because if I have 200 resumes to go through, I think the number is like the average resume is looked at for 6 to 10 seconds before there's
Mhm.
a decision to kind of dive into it or not. So it's quick.
Yeah.
And so do I need to get rid of that? Because at the end of the day, I need good people, and companies need good people. So I think it's more hype um than reality, but there's certainly some companies that are leaning into it like anything else. But I think it's a small minority.
Maybe smaller than we think about from the perspective
I think
of
it.
the AI type of technology, reading the resume and classifying it without some type of oversight, human oversight coming in.
I
Yeah,
think you
it's,
still
it
have it
feels
because
very small.
applicant tracking
Yeah.
systems have had screening capabilities for a very long time.
Hmm.
And so even when you'd have those earlier, when I was doing sales at careerbuilder.com, and we would be working with like Providence, who would get 100,000 resumes, and they'd set up screening questions. If they didn't have enough applicants, they would look at the people who didn't pass the screening, because at the end of the day, it's their job to hire people.
Hmm.
And so they might start with a certain group, but that's because the content is relative to what they're looking for. This goes back to the idea of you have to have really good content. It's got to be strong. And you probably hear A/B testing a lot when it comes from a marketing perspective, but I
Hmm.
think the same thing's true for creating a resume. If you're not tracking what you're doing when you send out your resumes, you're falling short.
And where's your perspective on the one size fits all resume versus the targeted
Yeah,
approach?
one size fits all doesn't help anybody. It's not,
Yeah.
unless you're going to a very small company that needs you to wear multiple hats. Most people are paying for specialization. And so if you want to look at a sales role and a customer service role or a marketing role, I think you just need to have a different resume for each of
Hmm.
those functions, and be able to talk to, these are the sales roles that I'm interviewing with, when you're in the interview, and talk about the sales ones, and
That makes
just
sense.
keep focused on that one area. But if you're looking at other paths, just have a different resume, have a different conversation piece, because at the end of the
Hmm.
day, most people, when they get a resume, are looking at it right before they go into an interview. People aren't studying it.
Yeah.
Right before they
That's.
walk into an interview, they take it, they scan it real quick, and they're like, what questions am I going to ask?
Hmm.
So that's where it comes back to content. And to me, it's like numbers stand out to people. If you've got numbers in there, they're going to look at it and focus it. And so you have to have perspective to those numbers, where people can then ask the questions based on that.
That makes a lot of sense. So, what advice do you give to people who maybe are trying to break into sales? Maybe they have a really nice work history, but it's not been a traditional sales role. How do you help them kind of come into this, into translating into what you think is so important for that content?
Yeah, so it depends where you are in your career, and what you've done, right? So as an example, let's say that you were sales adjacent and
Hmm.
you were working as a waiter. You know, what I'm looking for is somebody who can handle a conversation, go back and forth, and ask questions, be naturally curious. Um, and when they're talking about their experience, they're positioning in a way that you can tell that they're used to kind of already selling something or
Hmm.
positioning something. So if you're a waiter and you're trying to tell me why you'd be good at sales, if you say, hey, I worked at Luigi's Cafe for 4 years, and every Friday we'd have a competition to see who can sell the most specials. And 90% of the time, out of five people, I would sell the most by 15%. Just some kind of nugget that shows that you understand that you've got to position it and you've got to articulate your value proposition, because your value proposition in this is you, but
Mhm.
eventually it's going to be the company's value proposition.
That makes a lot of sense. And having people be able to speak to the fact that the way they can articulate that really can help demonstrate their ability to believe in what they were representing, how they are able to hear what people are asking or saying
Yeah.
back to them and pivoting around. That makes a lot of sense
Yeah.
too.
And
So,
it can be trickier, the further you get removed. Like if
mhm,
you're in finance, you know, the narrative needs to change, and you need to maybe draw on some personal things. Like, hey, I understand that I've been a CPA for the last 4 years, but here are some other things that I've done. I'm on the board of our nonprofit that does fundraising, and we raised $20,000 by going and soliciting gifts. And then we have this event. So I understand it's not the same, but these are some of the areas that I could pull from my personal experience for a position like this.
that's a great point to make. Again, reaching into what are the other things that we already aren't inclined to be doing and just realizing that they have relevancy. Talk a little bit about the some of the interview techniques. What strategies do you recommend for people when they're interviewing? Maybe they also feel pressure with life. The top three things maybe you try to express to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you're interviewing, you have to look at it, and this might be easier for me to say because I've always been in a sales environment. Now I'm doing sales recruiting, but look
Mhm,
at it as like a sales cycle. And what I mean by that is you've got your resume that you're sending out to the world.
mhm,
And so you need to track where you're sending it and if you're getting a response. And then if you're getting a response, are you getting the amount of responses you feel like you should get? And if not, change it up to see if you get better response rate. And then when you get to the next part, it's going to be a recruiter screen. When you're having the recruiter screen, are you then getting to the hiring manager screen? If you're getting to the hiring manager, are you getting to here? And so depending on the industry, they might have anywhere from 1 to 10 steps.
mhm.
And so you've got to track every step to know where you're falling short, because then you can kind of take control on the areas that you might be falling short on, because it might be the resume, but it might be your ability to close the hiring manager for the next step. It might be when you're in a panel interview, you get to panel interviews every time, and for some reason you're falling short. And that's where you might be able to go back to people and say, hey, can you explain to me why I didn't get this role? Because I've noticed that I've been falling short when I get to panel interviews, and they might say, you know what? When somebody asks you a question, you look at them when they're asking the question, but then you seem to look at the most who you seem to be think might be the most important person in the room to answer the question. And so you might not realize you're doing these little things that if you track it, you can find out these little things that will get you to that next offer.
I think that is such an important piece of advice for people, Tim, because those little subtleties and those nuances like that are really important. And unless we go and ask for feedback, we don't get it. Um, and
And
so
some people
that's a
might,
huge one.
and some companies won't give you feedback. It's
Yeah.
just policy, they won't. But a lot will, because they've been on the other side of it and they want to help you.
Mhm.
And then the other thing I think people need to realize is, especially in a market like right now, there are a lot more people looking for jobs than there are jobs.
Mhm.
So if you've got a role that gets 300 applicants, they might interview 3 to 5 people. So that means they're interviewing 1 to 1.5% of the people who apply,
Yeah.
who gets to an offer. So you just have to do a lot more activity. You have to do a lot more outside the box in terms of the networking things we
Mhm.
spoke about, and realize that it might not be you, it might be
Mhm.
the environment. You just have to do more to compensate for what the environment looks like at the moment.
That persistence is really
Yeah.
incredibly important right now. One of the things that stands out to me as well when as I listen to you is this need that we just as human beings have, right? Of control. And when we're in a time as we are now where there's more uncertainty, there's a sense of lack of control.
Yeah.
Yet when I listen to you, I think what you described so far feels like there's a lot we can control in this job search arena if we think of it from the way you're speaking. And that to me feels very um, I don't know if comforting is quite the right word, but it does feel like there's something that can be done versus
Yeah.
feeling like something we're just a victim into of these things that are happening around us that we can't control right now.
Yeah. You can control the input. Sometimes you can't control the output.
Right.
You can
That's a
put a lot
great
of
point.
effort into it, but you can't necessarily make somebody hire you.
Right.
And so you got to control the things that you can, which is your effort and your energy, and the time that you're putting into it. But
Yeah.
also, are you just throwing stuff everywhere? Because it's very easy to apply everywhere. And I'm not saying don't do that. But also know that if you're applying to a company and you've got four different resumes and you've applied to four different roles within that company, and you're like, well, I'm a perfect fit for all four of them, you kind of already showed that you don't know where you want to go. And
Right.
most people want somebody who know the direction that they're going, not just on a job search, but
Mhm.
most things, leadership or whatever it might be. And so if you're applying to a company, I say stay focused on that role for that company. And then when you get the reject letter, go to the next role that seems like the best fit. But if you
But
do it
don't do it
all
all
at
the
once,
same.
if you're doing
Yeah.
it all at once, you're kind of like raising your hand saying anything. And
Yeah.
that's not the right approach.
Yep. That makes a lot of sense. So when you see candidates researching potential roles, what is some of the specific information that they should maybe arm themselves with before interviewing? I know we've talked a little about the role itself, but tell
Yep.
what are some of the top things you try to prepare people for that work with you?
Yeah, I mean, doing some research,
Yeah.
whether regardless of what kind of economy it is,
Hmm.
you want to do research where if they ask you, do you know what we do? Saying, hey, a recruiter hit me up and they thought it'd be a good fit doesn't really wow anybody. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter the industry. And so you might think that you're coming across as like in demand and hard to get, but you need to do your research. And for me, it's looking at the company and the person that you're going to be talking to. And so the person that you're talking to, you want to know when you look at their career path and their progression, not that you might have the same exact, but things that might come up as issues in other interviews, like, hey, your stints have been short. Well, if the person you're talking to has had short stints, then that's not something you have to worry about. Or you can say, hey,
Mhm.
I noticed that you went from XYZ company to XYZ company, similar to you. I made this pivot because so being able to relate on certain items, whether it's the industry, the product, the company, knowing their progression can help you in that conversation where you might hit a foreseen brick wall. The company, I mean, most companies, if you go to YouTube, have a pretty quick overview of what they do.
Mhm.
You can get a very good understanding in a very short amount of time because their marketing department has put this together to sell people, whether it's
Yeah.
the employee brand or the product, where you can get up and running really quick. So if you're not doing that, you're falling short. And then, lean on your network. The further you get along, I don't think you do it for initial screen, but if you want to know other insight, there's places like Glassdoor where you have to realize where the messaging is coming from because there's going
Mhm.
to be very bad and there's going to be very good. And so somewhere in the middle lies the
Yeah.
truth. And so I would focus on a little bit of each. And if there's a reoccurring theme, if it's a concern for you, bring it up. They should be able to address it.
I think that's a really important part of this preparation is what are the questions that people should be coming into interviews with, right? Because it does become a two-way street to
Yeah.
understand what they're seeing and what's going on. And I think the more people can become very skilled in thinking about those questions as it relates to what you were just saying, like understanding the research you've done and really trying to be more nuanced and more targeted into the company and the role, not just about your own personal benefit. I think that's a really important
Yeah.
component as well.
Well, there's a natural curiosity. I mean, and I think that's human nature. If we're having a conversation and I'm just talking, you're not gonna probably leave the conversation thinking like, oh, we should hang out again. But if there's
Yeah.
a natural curiosity for me to say, oh, you do, you've hiked 4 mountains. Why do you do that? And like, so the natural curiosity, not only from a personal perspective, but from the company and what they do and the questions you ask, I think it's more important sometimes the questions that you're asking versus the answers you're giving to the questions they're giving, because it
Yeah.
shows your ability to listen. It shows your ability to have done the research and put it all together. It's not necessarily the questions that they're asking as much as the ones that you're going to ask. So have some ready
Yeah.
that you've done the research and you've got questions you want to know, and those could change during the conversation. But then also have a couple that come up through the conversation that if it's not natural, you're asking at the end of the conversation.
Very good. And I think that's really important takeaway. Let's shift gears just a little bit and talk about the reality of people that are in the workplace. We all have had those moments of getting pinged on LinkedIn by somebody who's trying to say they want to represent us for a position. So with so many of these recruiters reaching out on platforms like that, how can job seekers really evaluate the quality of a recruiting partner that they want to work with, being really mindful and maybe also just not thinking that they're having to put all their eggs in one basket? I think that's a really important part of this conversation. I would want you to share your thoughts on.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not a eggs in one basket sort of guy, right? I
Yeah.
mean, the reality is that unless you're super senior, like the CEO of Chipotle, who's now the CEO of Starbucks, I don't think you should have just one representation. And you can have multiple people helping you on your search. I mean, when you're looking for a job, I always say, hey, I'm an extension. Why not have somebody helping you look if you're looking at the same time? You don't need to shut down what you're doing, but let me bring other opportunities that I'm seeing that based on our conversation. And to your question, like, how are you vetting that? I think like anything else, you're looking at what's their digital footprint, like how long have I been doing this? What is
Mhm.
my area of focus? And who is in my network that we might know that's a mutual connection. And then when you're having the conversation, earlier you asked why I got into the business, and part of it was somebody said you could do this, and I thought maybe I should do this. The other part was whenever I had a recruiter call me, it was like, how much do you make? What do you want to make? And the conversation was either prolonged from that period or it was cut dead. And I thought, man, that didn't feel very good. That was like five
Mhm.
minutes. And when I'm talking to somebody, the conversations can go very long because I want to know what are the motivators, what are you looking for? Because if you go somewhere and you're there for a year or two, like either you or the company's not happy. And I want to
Yeah.
build a business that's a repeatable, um, referred business. And so I think you've got to evaluate the conversation when you are having those conversations. Like, do you feel like the person was listening to you and had your best interest, or did it seem one-sided?
They're just checking a box or trying to hit their own quota numbers of who they're going
Checking
to
a
speak
box,
into.
but are they bringing up things that you didn't think about?
Right.
Whether it
So
be on your
bringing value into
resume,
the
or are they
conversation.
bringing value, or was it a good use of your time? And
Yeah.
do you enjoy them? Because the reality is people partner with people that they enjoy interacting with.
Hmm.
And so who they're interacting with is very rare that you're going to be working with a company as a recruiter, a third party recruiter like me, where you really don't like who you're partnering with. So when I'm helping someone find a job for a company, there's an extension of my brand going both ways. That if there is not a match, like I'm not going to dirty myself with that on either side of the equation.
Yeah, the brand part is so huge because that is a really important point that I think maybe gets missed on both sides. Sometimes that reflection is really important to feel that you've that it's been true partnership, it's been valued, and you can't say enough about the impact on a brand in any whether it's personal or a company level.
Yeah. I
Bad
mean,
dynamics can have a really terrible outcomes.
100%. Yeah. And you also have to look at like what type of role and how big of a jump, and does it make sense? So there's other things that you can very quickly get a sense of, like, is this like a volume
Hmm.
issue that the company's dealing with, or is it a quality thing? So you can kind of get a sense based on the roles that they're bringing your way. So I think, the early on, it's more the digital exploring
Yeah.
or digital looking in to see, like, do I want to warrant a conversation? And then once you have the conversation, do they bring the value?
So should people ever expect to pay to work? Should any candidates ever expect to pay to work with a recruiter?
Well, I would never say never to anything, but I would never pay. Right. So never say never, but I never would. Um, Look, in this market, um, there are third-party companies that have, because the job orders aren't there, they're trying to find a way to make up for the lost revenue. And so they're doing like resume reviews and rewrites and LinkedIn refreshes where it's a couple $100. So that's a
Hmm.
decision, but you should never pay a percentage or a couple thousand. And I think you're going to get advice from 10 different recruiters that tell you 10 different things.
Hmm.
And so you've got to take ownership and say, okay, I heard your advice and I like this piece and I'm going to implement this piece and just run with it. And so I wouldn't pay to have someone, and
Hmm.
especially if they're going to take a percentage. Like, there's a newer model out there where for entry level, they basically get a percentage for each year you're at a place. Like, I wouldn't do
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Those sound a little bit, uh, sounds like there's a lot of slippery slope there in that.
Well, it depends. There's value, but from a sales perspective, I've seen people take these boot camps that are like $5,000 to $10,000 and never get into sales.
Yeah.
Like, because there's things that you don't know until you get into it, that, like, hey, picking up the phone and cold calling, like, that's not fun. Like,
Right.
I don't think anyone in sales has ever thought like, hey, I love doing this. And so, you know, I think there's elements of, like, if you're paying to get some kind of certification or or education, I think a lot of it can be done for free on YouTube.
Yes. That is such
I
an
mean,
important piece of advice for people right now.
everyone's trying to get famous for whatever reason it might be,
Yeah.
but whatever your subject is, I mean, I have a squeaky garage door. So I'm watching these individuals who are professional garage people showing me how to fix it. Like,
Yeah.
in the past, I would have to call somebody, I'd have to do it. So if you're thinking about, like, hey, I might want to get into this from a sales perspective, go somewhere where you have to go make cold calls. See if you're
Yeah.
actually willing to do it. Because some of the entry level roles that I work on, during the interview process, they'll put you in with a group of salespeople and you got to make cold calls.
You gotta see how you really it might sound good, but if you haven't really done it or you really don't, you're trying to sell yourself into it,
Yeah. Yeah.
it really does open up the reality check there.
Yeah.
Well, so as we get to wrapping up our
Yeah.
conversation, I've got one final question for
Yep.
you, maybe two, but let's just
Okay.
say one for now. So, what's one piece of practical advice you'd give someone who feels maybe they're getting overlooked in kind of this current job market?
Have a conversation with somebody. I mean, my thing is always, one, the looking at it as a sales cycle, knowing where you're falling short. And two, I always say, if a 7-year-old can't understand it, it's overcomplicated.
Yeah, great
So
point.
if so, regardless of what your messaging is, even if you're a networking thing, people just want to know what you do. I recruit for sales roles. And then if
Yeah.
they want to draw in, well, what kind of companies? Well, I do 70% are tech and 30% being this and that and that. But if I started by just saying it, spewing it all out, I'm going to lose my audience.
Right.
So I think when you're looking at your value proposition from, like, when you're networking, have it nice and tight and be ready to expand on it. And then on your resume, same thing, like, your parents, for most people, or your spouse, are the people who are going to love you more than anyone. They have no idea what you do. Or maybe that's just my family. But they love you and they have an idea, but you need to have somebody that if you explain it and they can't just tell you what they do, it's too complicated.
I think that's really, really important.
So I think the biggest thing is really knowing where you're falling short and
Knowing where you're falling short.
have the
Yes.
activity to follow up. And at the end of the day, this is a market where if you're feeling down, it's a tough market. It's not you. It's not a normal market where you've got a lot of movement. And so you just got to keep pushing ahead and doing
Mhm.
what you can control, and eventually things will turn.
I just want to say, Tim, thank you so much for the time. You've just given the listeners so many different really solid nuggets, and hopefully wherever they're at in this process, they've got something really tangible to take and to start to explore. So thank you so
Yeah.
much for the time. And so for our listeners, we'll have free resources relevant to our conversation today that you can download at couragetoadvancepodcast.com, which will take you to our Spark Effect podcast page. And again, I want to thank Tim for sharing your journey and insights today. I want to thank the Empathy Edge for hosting our podcast subseries, and to the listeners for tuning into this episode of Courage to Advance, where transformative leadership isn't about having all the answers, it's about having the courage to find them. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Kim.